Today, I want to go on with our series on what do you do if a child, an adolescent, a tween, a teen, a young adult discloses something about what's happening to them, or maybe it's just a sentence that makes you need to ask a clarifying question because oftentimes they're testing the water before they dive in, right? They want to know how you're going to react. Even if they don't know that's what they're doing, I mean, for sure, they're scared already. There are many reasons why it takes a long time for most people to tell someone or to disclose something about abuse. They might have been threatened. Of course, they might have been told or promised that they would get a great gift or a new bike or a trip to Disneyland. Who knows? It depends on who the abuser is and what tactics they're using. But the child or the young person is really in a state of altered reality. So the reason that they're not disclosing sooner is because it takes something to even say a sentence, because they are already housing what happens in secret. There is a shame connected to something that happens to a person in secret where they are told or threatened or rewarded for keeping it a secret. So that blame and self-shame is the next step in this series of what to do if someone discloses. And the next point is to free the person, the child, the adolescent, the tween, teen, the young adult. Anyone 25 years or under is who I consider a child. That your mind is still developing, your ability to negotiate and understand the world is still developing, your conscience is still developing. You are not fully formed in your brain cells until you're, 26 and sometimes older if there has been, any kind of, alcohol or drug use or whatever that you might even have a little bit of a harder time disclosing because some of those pathways to what's going to happen to me when I tell might have been a little bit compromised. There are certain physical things that happen to you. Certainly, trauma is also something that keeps the brain from moving forward. That arrested development thing. It's a physical thing, a sexual uh, thing that's happening, and also just the mind itself and its own development and its own pathways is still is still being developed. So, as you go on to this next step in the series to free the person of any self blame, first of all, the reassurance to that person that is talking to you and telling you something so personal. And like I said, it may just be a sentence. The first thing is that they are reassured on this journey of disclosing that they are not to blame in any way, shape, or form. They did not cause what happened to them. And might I just, as a side note, remind you that it wasn't anything to do with that young person. It doesn't matter what they were wearing or not wearing. It doesn't matter if they were drinking or not drinking. It doesn't matter if they were, using, if they were smoking pot or not. It doesn't matter where they were, if they were in a place where you don't think they should be. None of that matters. This is not the time to discuss, you know, boundaries and safe practices. This is not the time. None of that matters because what happened to them was not their fault. They are the one it happened to, and the self-blame that will surface the moment you raise your eyebrow or you begin to say, "Well, where were you? Well, why were you there?" If that's how you start to answer, they will shut down, they will not share, and you will have lost your opportunity to actually find out what actually happened. Now, maybe they'll come back to you later when they really want help, but they may be assaulted multiple times before that first attempt happens. I know somebody who tried to tell her mother at age 7, and she was actually on one of my podcasts. And when mom saw the blood, you know, on the underclothing and asked her what it was from, the response was, "Well, You'll get used to it. I know others that have said that their mother freaked out and it scared them so much they never tried to tell anything else to their mother because it was so scary to them that she, lost her mind. Um, or a father that gets so angry, I'm going to kill the person or anything like that. Those reactions are just absolutely destruction to the person disclosing and to their continuing to tell you more. So, okay, so we know that they're not to blame for what happened. Also, it's very important to remind them that they are not to blame for not stopping it. Like questions such as, why didn't you run? Why didn't you scream? Those are also the sorts of questions that will completely shut down the person who is trying to disclose because they all of a sudden they are reinforced with the shame and the fact that they're being blamed. I know it's probably not intended, but they're being blamed for not doing something about it. Most young people, male or female, freeze. They are incapacitated. They are in shock. They sometimes don't even know what is happening to them. They don't even have words for it. And so when you start asking the why questions, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you bite or kick or scream or yell or run or walk away or just walk out the door? Any of that is going to deepen the sense of shame, guilt, and blame that they already feel because what was done to them was done in secret and they were told not to tell in one way or another. So, though, it might seem really unimaginable to somebody who has never been through sexual assault or abuse, um, shame and self blame are some of the most common and the most, in my opinion, destructive things that a child or a human being is left with in the world of, oh my gosh, it was my fault. I'm ashamed. I have all this guilt. And you're like, how can you have all the guilt? The person that did this to you is the person that should have all the guilt, all the shame, all the blame. But I have heard it in so many various ways by telling my own story. And I was a full grown adult when I was really trying to share my story. I was 27. My son had just been born when I kind of shared it to more than just my family members, and I really hadn't even gone into detail, the gory details as I used to call it, the icky stuff. That's basically what I said when I was disclosing to my mom and dad the first time, at age 16. I was like, well, and there was icky stuff. I would talk about, well, it was this and he took me here and there and and then there was the voices and the aliens and you're trying to unpack your altered reality story back into the reality of what the truth of your life is. And it's hard to find the words. I mean, I didn't know words that were brainwashing words. I didn't know that some of the tactics that were used on me had actual names. You know, I didn't know that inculcation was taking a familiar story that somebody already believes and just inculcating or inserting, changing certain details about a very familiar believed story so that what is happening to the person at the time of their manipulation and their assault and their brainwashing is almost familiar or believable. I didn't know that that had a name when I was 16. I didn't know it had a name till I was in my 40s. So it's interesting when you start disclosing. I was 27. My brain, I think, was pretty much fully developed, except for what was stunted in there because of the abuse, which absolutely I had arrested development in relationships and missing out on my, early teenage years when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. There are definitely things that I know were not developed during those years in the way that a normal, teenager has relationships with boys and has crushes and all those things. I didn't get to do that. So there were things that definitely I carried over into my adult life, that became problematic for me in my relationships and in my marriages. And those are just things that are a result of that abuse and how it does, affect your development and your brain development and your emotional development. So I just think that's an important thing to remember that, as an adaptive measure, children and young people will take responsibility for for their abuse, excuse me, for their abuse, rather than acknowledge, how completely out of control they feel. It's almost like a way of taking control because they feel so out of control because the people that usually are abusing, our children and young people and even our college students are usually older adults and maybe only a few years older, but that makes a big difference when you're in those developmental years. Like if a 17-year-old is being groomed by somebody that's 24, 25, 26 in that age range, it looks totally like, well, maybe that isn't abuse, but it is abuse. It's absolutely abuse because that span of those 7, 8 years is a big span in the way that a person's, development is happening. And so that's why so often I always say that teenagers don't seem to be believed or to have their stories taken seriously nearly enough, and it's because people don't realize that often the abuser, the person grooming them is only a few years older than they are, but that is still abuse, and it is still grooming, and it is still absolutely 100% an unfair match. The brain power and the manipulative, um uh, you know, artistry that somebody at age 24, 25, 26 can have over a 15, 16, 17-year-old is significant. And so I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. And that they will kind of take the responsibility for the abuse almost to feel in control because they feel so out of control. And so they'll stuff it and they'll remain in a state of shame, blame, and guilt. And we have to get them out of that in order for them to continue to talk, to disclose, and to do all of the things that need to happen so that that perpetrator, that predator, can face the consequences of their actions. Um, so I think another thing that I've already touched on, but I want to make sure it's really clear that the way that young people start to uh, manage themselves in their world, in their orbit, at their home, in their communities, in their sports or their, school classes or whatever, is they become, and they already are, but they also become more and more aware of the feelings of others. When you're 2 years old, the whole world revolves around you. And, you know, you want what you want. And as you get a little bit older developmentally, you start to realize that, oh, when I when I act this way, I might get what I want. And when I act that way, I usually don't get what I want. You start to understand how the world works. And then as you get into those, 8, 9, you start to understand that what you did might have hurt someone else. That's when empathy and the ability to have a conscience, it's the birth of your conscience, of conscious mind, where what I do can can be harmful to someone else. That's right around that age 8, 9, 10, and you're starting to go, "Oh, I actually have empathy," or "I actually can learn to care about someone," and when I do that, they usually give that back to me if they've been in a nurturing, loving environment, and now you get all of those ages and into those early tween years, and the feelings around them, they are starting to be very astute to the feelings of people around them. So if they feel that they are the cause of your pain, your upset, your I'm gonna, kill that person or whatever people say, because I've heard that a lot from people. I'm like, yeah, you think you would, that's what you think because you're a good mom or dad, but you really wouldn't. I hope, because then you'd be in jail and not the perpetrator. But that is the reactions that we have to hold ourselves back from having while someone is disclosing to us. Um, so even if another thing that I think people forget too is that, you know, sometimes it might be, a younger child with an older child. Like I have a person in my life that, was about 5 or 6 and the older child was 9 or 10. So there's that 4 or 5 year, um, you know, and maybe the younger child basically gave what you would call permission. Like they said, not even if they were asked consent, because obviously a 10-year-old isn't probably asking for consent. They don't even know what that is. They usually oftentimes have probably been sexualized in some way, which is why they're acting out that sexualization on a younger child. And so even with that, where a child acts willingly, in the face of something, being uh, performed on them, or something that they're asked to perform on another child, the older child maybe, or even a child of the same age. It doesn't imply consent. So for sure, there is no consent, no matter what the age of, the children, or an older teen with a 9-year-old, let's say, there is no consent. Okay. If uh, a child gives permission, or even requests, like to play a sexual sort of game, or a touching game, or it never would excuse an adult who would be, or a teen, uh, on the receiving end of that. And that older child, and older teen, and older young adult, and older adult, they always have to take full responsibility. Now, there are various places that get help for both children, both if it's a child that is perpetrated on another child, they usually both need help. And there are places who have really good programs, um, that are in, various communities, but they're not everywhere. So I think that's really important too, that it's always the adult's responsibility to limit, or the the sexual, like, I want to play a touching game, or I want to play a sexually charged game. The adult has to say no. The adult has to be the person to set those boundaries. The child is never accountable. 100% of the time, the child is never, ever accountable. Okay. So, I think lastly, you want to stress over and over to the child, between the teen, the young adult, that this person shoulders all of the responsibility for what happened. They shoulder that blame, that guilt, and that they need help. And that this child is also someone who will need to talk about things and might need help, but you would say it differently to the child. It would be more like, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to be able to, get through all of these feelings and experience together. We're going to make sure that you have the right people to talk to, and that this person that did this to you, they need help. They need help from other grown-ups, because they need to get better. This isn't how they should act. Um, but that the child, um, gosh, they're not to blame. I guess that's really what it is, so that the child can feel free of those feelings of shame, self-shame, self-blame, the guilt, the confusion, all of those things that they're experiencing. So that's that's it for today. Thanks for listening.